4th year that we've been doing this now. Second time that we've done it in an online sort of fashion. And you'll notice that we're using, with the Zoom space, we're using the webinar function rather than like the Zoom meeting function, which is a lot less interactive, right? I mean, it's a little bit simpler in terms of attention because, you know, you see kind of, you know, the main panel and that kind of stuff rather than, you know, hundreds of faces, but it's a lot less interactive. But we will use the Zoom meeting function when we're doing we've got an interactive workshop at the end of the series. So we'll use the Zoom meeting function there, but this is the webinar function, but the chat box does work. So, you know, if you want to, you know, say hi to everybody and maybe, you know, let people know where you're sort of tuning in from and so on, then please do use the chat box. There's also Q&A function as well as the chat box. So you can use the chat and you can use the Q&A to put some questions in. And towards the end of the session, the last sort of part of the session, Geeta, who's going to be hosting the conversation, will take a little bit of time to, you know, draw on some of your questions and take some of those questions to the panelists who are joining us. So please do use that. I mean, yeah, it's a limited kind of interaction, but it's some kind of interaction, right? So, yeah, as I said, this is the 4th time that we've the 4th conference, Regenerative Activism conference. It's a series which is being hosted by the ULEX project, by Advaya, and by Geeta. And my name's G. I'm from the ULEX project. We're an activist training organisation. We're based in Catalonia, and we try to create spaces, trainings, and other kinds of spaces where people in social movements, especially in Europe, that's our main focus actually, can kind of learn from each other. You know, where we can learn from each other's struggles and through that build capacity for impact and the resilience in our social movements. Advaya is run by Christabel and Ruby, who are sisters. You may have seen them in the previous sessions. You may see them next week as well. They're not actually sort of showing up in person this week. And they organise events like this. And, you know, it's thanks to them that all of the sort of logistics and organisational kind of background stuff has all happened. They said what they say about themselves as an organisation is that they do transformative education sitting at the intersection of ecology, well-being, spirituality and community, which sounds great. And it is actually really great what they do. And then there's Geeta. And Geeta Pariha is actually the person who kicked this all off. So Geeta introduced us at ULEX to Advaya a few years ago after Geeta had been on a training with us. And through making that connection, kind of like inspired the whole series of the conferences. So that's Geeta. And I won't say so much about Geeta now because she's going to host the whole thing today, and she can sort of, you know, you'll get to see her. But Geeta's great. So yeah, so this series this year, the conference is 4 sessions. This is number 3, and as I mentioned already, after the 4th session, on the 21st of March on a Sunday, there's also an interactive workshop. One of the things I've been asked to emphasise in the intro now is that if you want to come on the workshop on that Sunday, it's important that you sort of respond to an email that I think Ruby or Christabel will have sent out so that we know how many people are coming. And if you sign up like that, you'll also be sent a questionnaire because we want to design that day in a way that's really responsive to people's interest, right? We want to make it really interactive, really participatory. So there's a questionnaire that will come out to you if you're going to come on the day. And, you know, we'll use that to design the day in a way that's really responsive. So do sign up for that if you want to be come along to the workshop. So what's it all about? I mean, basically, you know, this idea of regenerative activism, it's, you know, well, it's a space to learn from each other. It's a space where we're exploring what is it to develop practices in activism, in our social movements that are regenerative. Why do we talk about regenerative activism? Well, we talk about it because our starting point is to acknowledge that we live in a world where interlocking systems of oppression, they contribute to our sense of disconnection, our alienation, and a sort of a kind of depletion, right, in our lives, in ourselves, in our communities, within our movements. And so we need to develop activist strategies, activist practices that actually restore, renew, and revitalize us and our collective struggles. You know, we used to talk a lot about sustainable activism, but actually sustaining isn't enough. We need to regenerate and build, renew, and revitalize our energy, our resources as movements and as activists. So that's what we're doing. And this year, we're focusing at a sort of movement level. I mean, we think about these practices as practices that do happen at the personal level. You know, there are personal practices and approaches that are regenerative and sustaining. There are practices at the organizational level within our groups as well, you know, how we create cultures between us. And there's also there are questions about, and how does this translate to a kind of movement level? What's regenerative activism when we think in the sort of movement dimension? So we're focusing on that more this year, although all these levels do connect to each other. The first session was on you know, building movement resilience, especially in the face of repression. Last week we were talking about narrative, culture, and power, and the place of narrative and culture in movement building. And this week, well, Geeta is going to explain all about this week, so I won't waste your time listening to me any longer. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over, I think, to Lindsay briefly, who's going to guide a short grounding reflection before Geeta comes to hold the panel discussion. So yeah, great. I'm really glad that you have all joined us, that you're all with us today. And I will check out for now, sit in the background and listen intently. Over to you, Lindsay.
Thanks, G. So we're just going to take a couple of minutes at the beginning of the session just to fully arrive and to bring ourselves more fully to being here, gathering our awareness and situating within this shared space that we have. And just taking a moment of stillness together to kind of leave behind whatever we've been doing during the day, whoever we've been with, whatever we've been focusing on, and bring our attention fully to be here together. So just taking a moment to settle into the body in such a way that you feel comfortable, you feel nice and grounded. And maybe if you're comfortable doing so, just closing your eyes for a couple of minutes. Just letting your eyes close. Or alternatively, just softening your gaze and letting it fall in front of you, either to your desk, to the floor, just lightly, gently, unfocused. And just taking a deep breath in through your nose and a long breath out, and just settling more fully into the body. Feeling the body settle. Feeling the weight drop down your body. The muscles releasing. And just bringing awareness to what's going on, what's happening in our body, what are we feeling? Noticing the energy of the body. And just consciously bringing your awareness to your connection, maybe with a chair or a cushion, to the ground beneath your feet. And feeling the weight of your body drop down your legs, to your feet, to the ground, to the earth. And just bringing our awareness to our breathing, and to the physical sensation of our breathing. And just gathering our awareness and putting it on the breath, taking a couple of breaths. And just aware that tonight there's people listening in from all around the world in this conversation, and though we can't be in the same room as each other, we can still sense into, we can still visualize or imagine each other in all these different parts of the world. People who care passionately, people who are here to learn. Now just taking one last breath in and one long breath out. And in your own time, opening your eyes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lindsay, for that really beautiful grounding way to begin the evening. And thank you so much to G as well for setting the wider framing for this series. So my name's Geeta, and I will be moderating this evening's session. It is on global movements, power and resource and resilience. And we're looking at this particularly in the context of environmental movements, who are a very broad and diverse set of bodies. You can have very well-funded think tanks, and you can have volunteer, local, grassroots-based networks who may not have anything really in common other than the broad sense of acting to deal with the environmental crisis we're facing. And that crisis itself is very has very particular aspects that perhaps are unique to it, and those include the scale of the problem, they include the urgency, and they include an ongoing sense of loss, irrecoverable loss, in many ways, including not only for ourselves but for future generations. On top of that, many NGOs and organizations seek to fight patriarchal, extractivist, neoliberal cultures and structures that often lead to the environmental problems that we're seeing. But inadvertently, some of those same practices and structures can embed themselves within the NGO structures and movements also. And that can lead to misuse of power. It can also fuel or exacerbate feelings of disillusionment or burnout. On top of that, there are in many parts of the world deep threats to environmental defenders, which include loss of life. And last year, Global Witness recorded the highest number of deaths of environmental defenders so far. That wasn't enough. Environmental injustice intersects with a layer of other kinds of injustices, which include social, economic, racial, geographic, and those are just to name a few. And often the kind of solutions that are presented can be false solutions that are seen as quick fixes, but don't actually address the problem and can often exacerbate some of those injustices. So environmental movements working within these sectors do face a broad range of challenges. So this session will be discussing those challenges and also looking at the promise of how do we build a resilient environmental movement in the way that G was describing. So a movement that not only weathers storms, but is able to organizationally thrive and remain transformative and creative and come up with ways that sustain and regenerate positive solutions, both for the planet and society, as well as for the organizations and movements involved. So that's the focus of our panel discussion this evening, and I've got a wonderful panel to be discussing that with. They include Kumi Naidoo, who started his career as an activist age 15 as a South African anti-apartheid activist, and has also been head of Greenpeace International and Amnesty International. Nnimmo Bassey, who is currently chair of the Health of Mother Earth Foundation in Nigeria, but was also chair of Friends of the Earth International and is a poet and author. And Silje Lundberg, who began her career again at the tender age of 12, setting up a local youth group to fight oil drilling, and is now chair of Friends of the Earth Norway. So a very warm welcome to all of you, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. It should be a really exciting and enlivening one. I'm going to start off exploring a little bit more this issue of challenges. I'd love to explore that all with you a little bit. And I'm going to start with Nnimmo. I know, Nnimmo, you've been having slight internet issues, so you're off camera at the moment, but if we could try putting you on camera, and seeing how that goes. So the first question, great, wonderful to see your smiling face. And so I'd like to start with you, Nnimmo. Looking at this context of environmental defenders and movement building, you've been an activist both at the very local and the global level, including against some of the biggest fossil fuel producers in the world, and in contexts where people have lost their lives. So it must be very difficult to try and build and sustain movements in that context. It would be great to hear a little bit about your experiences in that context.
Say that's really a very broad question indeed. But to start from the conclusion, in case I don't get there, I believe that the strength of the struggle is in the fact that we simply have no option. There are no options. It's a matter of life or death at the ground. You know, sometimes people talk about climate change campaigns and movements, and it all sounds as if you are counting molecules of carbon or just calculating temperatures 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees that doesn't get as low as 1.5. But we talk about climate change from the point of view of the end of the pipe where the carbon is not kept in the ground, but is being extracted and burnt. And not burnt both in the field, right there in the middle of the communities, as well as in areas where there's high consumption.
Sorry, Nnimmo, we're having difficulty hearing you, so it may be better.
What really keeps the struggle going is the fact that
Nnimmo, sorry, we're having difficulty hearing you.
The world is permitting right now is totally incomprehensible. We're talking about something worse than genocide. What is big? All right, so I'm sorry. The system is not cooperating. I can't see why.
It seems to be better with the camera off. So perhaps we can continue like that, though that it's a great shame we can't see you, Nnimmo, but at least we can hear you.
I'm sorry about that break. I guess I hope it's better now. And I'll just go very quickly. I was saying that the struggle, we've kept on the struggle because what is going on in communities with the extractive industry is making a kill, and what is going on in the corridors of multilateral negotiations are simply incomprehensible. I mean, things that are unacceptable. I would say that what is going on is worse than genocide. It's a kind of system that ought not to be accepted, that for so many years, nations are struggling to avoid responsibility. And then transnational corporations are carrying out activities with total irresponsibility, total unaccountability, and with a total sense of lack of care. And so when you are immersed in the struggle with people, communities who are suffering and who are fighting tooth and nail, who have nothing to lose except their chin, literally, you just can't help but continue to push along with them. So in a context, in a short way to say this is that we're confronting a situation where we don't have choices. And so the struggle just has to continue. So Geeta, if you heard me, I'll take a pause there.
Yes, absolutely. That was very powerful, Nnimmo, and it's true that in certain parts of the world it can seem a choice as to whether to become involved in environmental issues or not. And when it is something that's on your doorstep and it's a matter of your life and death, then that alternative doesn't really exist. So thank you for explaining that so powerfully. And the question you touched on there about negotiations and power dynamics is one that I want to also follow up with, Kumi. So environmental matters, Kumi, are often cloaked in global northern and southern power dynamics. They can connect to colonial histories and modern day corporate extractivism. So what kind of issues arise for environmental movements in navigating these complexities?
Sadly, these inequalities play out in a very real, material way in many of our movements. It orientates our movements in a logic that often centers the global north and marginalizes the global south. While I believe it is not at all intended, the end result is that it continues to perpetuate the patronizing white savior complex while marginalizing voices from the global south. So the implications for our movements is to take diversity and inclusion as seriously as anything, and recognize that if we are to build strong, resilient movements, right, we have to actually ensure that we are creating multiple pathways for a diversity of different constituencies to be able to participate in our movements. Now, one manifestation of this inequality is represented by funding, resource allocation, in narrative building, as well as even operationally. There are imbalances of power, resources, access to power, and visibility. Let me take a very mundane thing as an example, right? Now, you know, in the global north, we have very distinctive seasons, and often we talk in seasons. In the global south, it's less as clear as it is. And generally, we don't talk in seasons. Now, of course, if you're talking within the context of one country, it's fine to talk in whatever cultural logic matters. But in global movements, you will find even today, we will hear in movement that we have a summer campaign and a winter campaign and so on. But of course, just to be clear, the summer in the Northern Hemisphere is the winter in the Southern Hemisphere and vice versa, okay? And so when those seasons are used, it's like a very subtle betrayal of the mentality that still says the center of the universe is still the global north. And it's long overdue that some of these symbolic things, which cause offense to some people in the global south, and also confusion because people are wondering when exactly is the event taking place, and so on. And these things are long overdue for addressing. So what we find is some of these practices built up over time leads to further removing and alienating the organization and movement from the people that they are trying to serve. So, for example, governance structures of some of our international NGOs, for example, are sadly, just like the United Nations and other global institutions, are locked into the geopolitics of 1945, it would appear, where some, or a little bit later, but the logic is very much in an old power dynamic. So just to give you an example, in Greenpeace International, for example, in the decision-making, India and China and all of Africa each had 1 vote each, and Luxembourg had 1 vote, Belgium had 1 vote, and small other rich countries had 1 vote. And this is in a global organization. So I want to say that the time has come for us in movements to be able to exhibit a higher level of morality, ethics, and practice. We cannot be calling on people in the corporate sector and government to walk the talk, to show inclusivity and so on, when we ourselves cannot do it. If we fail to do it, we actually are failing to be as strong as we need to be for the very difficult struggles in the present and that lie ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumi. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. It reminds me of some things I was looking at about relationships to time, and how often Northern Western culture, it's very linear, and in other cultures and other parts of the world, it's very circular, as our sort of natural processes also. And businesses actually give training for staff on how to navigate different ways of perceiving time and deadlines, where the actual outcome in certain parts of the world is considered more important than whether you arrive at a certain point. And I think that is really, those discussions never happen in the NGO sector, which can be so deadline driven and not necessarily output driven in terms of looking at how you're actually arriving and what you're arriving. So a really powerful example there. Thank you. Silje, good evening. It's a very it's not always easy for NGOs in the global north to be able to unpack the role that's being played by countries, particularly ones that are regarded as progressive. They may still be having quite damaging global power politics. So how easy is it from a Northern movement perspective to be able to show solidarity with the global South and identify these and explain these kind of dynamics, while also encouraging positive local action?
Yeah, I mean, that is no doubt something that we struggle with, and that we see that the environmental movement in the North also struggles with. And I mean, I'm from Norway. I'm born in Norway, and just by being born, I've had enormous amounts of privilege because I am born in one of the most wealthy countries in the world. And we got so by being an oil state, by being a petro state, and plan on continuing to be that. And I mean, what we are seeing also within, especially within the environmental debate, is kind of how do you unpack the different power struggles that actually are in play, and how do you show also kind of the moral argument for why Norway needs to be one of the countries who do more, because we are so wealthy, because we have the systems that have been built in an equal way. But I mean, at the same time also, we are seeing within Norway as well. I mean, in Norway, we have our own indigenous peoples as well, the Sami people in Norway, in Sweden, Finland, and in Russia, northern parts. And our indigenous peoples are the ones who are on the front line of climate change, and are the ones who are feeling the consequences first in Norway, and it is affecting their nomadic ways, their culture, and if their culture can survive another 50 years. And we are also seeing that in Norway, those solutions that are being posed to climate change often end up doing even more harm to our Sami people, because they are false solutions. But the power play also within the country is kind of set to always gain or not to get. It's not the people who are going to gain from the shifts from fossil to a green shift, you know. But I mean, I think that the Northern movement, especially in countries like Norway, have a huge responsibilities to both to understand, to truly understand the privileges that we are, that we have. Like, I mean, like you said, I started in the environment movement when I was 12, but my life has never been threatened. And I've worked against oil and gas exploration for 20 years, but I have never felt threatened because of that. And I mean, that is a completely different story than the one of Kumi or than the one of Nnimmo. So I think that to actually understand the privileges that the Northern movements have, is essential for us to move on in a good way.
Thanks, Silje, and thanks also for identifying this point that the impacts or the consequences of decisions in the North do not have equal impact on people within northern countries, and that there are marginalized groups in the North, and as you say, in the context of Scandinavia, actually an indigenous population that still exists and that's bearing the brunt of some of the consequences. So Nnimmo, I'd like to come back to you now, if that's okay, and just explore this question of power dynamics a little bit more. And I was wondering, what's the kind of interplay and dynamic between, say, large, well-funded NGOs and smaller groups that can often be local, volunteer, part-time? How do those dynamics work? Are there tensions sometimes in terms of direction and engagement and power? Okay. Nnimmo, did you catch the question? Nnimmo, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I did not hear you because I was off. I was disconnected.
Oh,
Can
no
you
problem.
repeat the question?
Not at all. I was just asking, Silje was touching on the question of power dynamics, and I was asking, how in your experience, how do the dynamics between large, well-funded, big NGOs and smaller environmental, perhaps grassroots groups that could be maybe volunteer or unpaid or local level, how do those dynamics play out? Are there tensions? Are there concerns around direction? Nnimmo, did you hear that? Did that come through?
Sorry, I'm sorry to drag you back, but it was I couldn't get what you said.
Okay, no problem. It was a question about the dynamics between large, well-funded NGOs and local volunteer environmental groups, and are there tensions and how do they play out? How does that relationship play out?
Now I have to guess what the question is about dynamics, about collaboration between between activists in the North and the South, as well as geopolitical relationships.
It was more about actually the nature of funding. So some environmental groups are funded and they have a lot of funds and power comes a particular way, and other groups, particularly could say southern groups, but also in the North, are volunteer and part-time and are working in a very different kind of way. So it was more about that kind of issue.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that is very clear, because right now, I believe that there are many civil society organizations that are operating just like any other neoliberal setup, and like any other group of middle-class people having fun and just doing things that are convenient. And there are many groups that are funded by vested interest. Of course, you have a lot of funding from vested interest, and then you cannot really stand up to those same things that you ought to be fighting. But so that is very clear. And the good thing is that many of the groups struggling in the global South against these mammoth colonial structures are working with bare knuckles. They're working with little or nothing, and they're putting everything in the fray, and they're getting things done. But when you have groups that really, there's many cases where we have true solidarity between groups in the global North and groups in the global South, where sharing of resources helps to blunt the edges, sharp edges that would otherwise occur, and that happens very often. Take, for example, when some of us in the global south have to work with communities to litigate against transnational oil companies in their home countries. Now, the communities can't fund that kind of litigation. And usually it's not, you have to have a partner in the global north who will take up this. So it all depends. It depends on what context, what drives you, what kind of movement are you talking about? Is it a movement that is with the people, or a movement that just carries on with a struggle that is popular at the moment? There are many levels, many layers of collaborations, and many layers of meanings and beings that affects how these things play out.
Thanks, Nnimmo. Yes, so it sounds like there's a real diversity, and as you say, there can be positive engagements in terms of cases, which we're seeing a lot of really interesting northern-southern collaborations, as opposed to groups being instrumentalized, where you have a group that already has a plan and is just looking for, you know, someone to fit into the box of who they would want them to be and what role they want them to play. Kumi, you've held a broad range of positions as an activist, including with NGOs that are household names. Through that time, have you seen themes in terms of the kind of internal stresses that movements face?
Probably a bit too much of stresses. You know, it's important though to keep things in context, right? Some of these household names, organizations like Amnesty, Greenpeace, Oxfam, and so on, when they started decades and decades ago, right, more than 50 years ago. And at that moment, they were driven by a very volunteer ethic, right? It was driven by, you know, Silje's experience in Friends of the Earth as a 12-year-old, you know. It was driven not from bureaucracy or on having a huge infrastructure to maintain and so on. But what has happened is, as time evolved and as these organizations have become more and more complex, more and more larger, sadly, some of the governance and some of the ways of operating and all got stuck in a different era. And so even though I don't think anybody seriously is trying to say, let us look at how we can retain power in the North and so on. I'm not saying there's no people that think like that, but you know, I'm not saying that that's the dominant thing. So I don't think it's willful. But in reality, these tensions today play themselves out in tension between volunteers and paid staff. Now, even though when you look at our movements and especially our more structured NGOs, on paper, the volunteers are supposed to have more power and more voice and so on in governance terms and so on. But quite often in reality, the complexity of how our organizations have actually evolved and so on actually ends up being that the full-time paid staff have disproportionate influence over decision-making. The second way in which this plays out is that even though quite often when coalitions of civil society are building, people seek out the big branded household name NGOs because they feel that would give them oomph, right? But you will find that the answer of yes, we will join a coalition is more the exception rather than the norm. There's hesitancy, they're worried about either if you cannot get everything to be like what your policies are, then you're not going to go there. Right? But in coalitions, you have to be willing to be flexible. Now, the irony is that when sometimes the international NGOs do join coalitions, then you'll find other coalition partners saying, Aish, these people are sucking up oxygen, they joined late, but when the event happened, because they have the biggest communications and media teams, most of the publicity was you know, the oxygen was sucked up. So those are the, sorry. That was my timer telling me that I'm almost out of time. So the other thing that I would say that is a challenge is what might sound a bit unfair, but what I would call the ultra corporatization of the NGO sector, a point that Nnimmo mentioned, that in fact, our organizations are stuck, you know, not all, but quite a few, even though well-intentioned, trying to be realistic as we are forced to be quite often, trying to be strategic and so on. And these things sometimes lead you to a situation where there's an ultra-corporatization process. So we've built seriously complex organizations. We're highly dependent on certain skills and competencies in IT and human resource and so on. And the funny thing is we are often using the same consulting companies that our enemies are using to actually give them efficiency, because our organizations have become so complex. And the heavy fundraising ask on an annual basis can also be a challenge in terms of the weight and the pressure that puts you on and the mission creep that can come with that. And as Nnimmo pointed out, grants from certain sources can also have a potential to influence the decisions that one takes. The last point I just want to make is, you know, in our movements, another factor that is a very, you know, that relates to power and power dynamics is just the issue of language, right? And, you know, firstly, in most of our movements, English is the dominant language. You know, you can have the most brilliant activists from Indonesia, which is the 4th largest country in the world, right? But does not speak English. And then they are in a complete, you know, I'm not saying that these problems are easy to resolve, right? But we need to name it. We need to say that we cannot go on pretending that the way we are being is the world that we want to create, because we have huge chunks of the world's population excluded from many of what we call global movements. Now, there might be good reasons, repression, and so on, but I think there's an ethical imperative for us to be much better. You know, we got to be the change we want to see in the world. And I think if we are brutally honest, we have quite a lot of work to do. And then, by the way, it's, even if you are an English speaker, right, you'd say, okay, then you're okay. But then the jargonistic technical language and so on that's used, right? And this is not simply for the people in the movements, but our language, I believe, and our narratives is not sufficiently sensitive to where our people are. We are too often projecting our own consciousness on the people that we're trying to organize, rather than having the humility to understand where people are and humbling ourselves and starting there. I'm generalizing, of course, right? I'm generalizing, but I think if we are brutally honest with ourselves, these deficits in our movements are real and must be addressed. And let me just say why I feel so confident saying all of these things. Every criticism I'm making, I'm complicit, and I've made mistakes in not fighting as strategically to actually reverse some of these things, even though I might have tried in various positions that I've been in. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumi, for naming those different aspects so lucidly, and for your honesty in acknowledging how hard it can be to address them. And the thing that often gets shot back is the time issue. There is no time, and this is something I know we'll come back to discussing more transformative, creative ways of engaging with this issue, but thank you for that. Silje, my last question from this set of questions is to you, and as someone who has been an activist since you were 12, I'd like to ask you about the key role that the youth movement is playing in climate activism, and do you see that the youth are taking a more regenerative approach to climate activism? Are there things that we can learn? It would be really helpful to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Well, I think that the youth movement have played or play an important role, and in Norway has done for many years. Our youth organization for climate, Young Friends of the Earth Norway, has been around for 55 years now, I think. So, I mean, it is. And they have an age limit on 25, so they kick people out every year when they reach retirement age, which is 25. You're not allowed to be a part of kind of that youth movement. Then you have to move on, which I think is really good, because then you don't have time to have kind of people just taking up space, because they with the years you also your ego grows, and I mean. Yeah, it doesn't Young Friends of the Earth, at least in Norway, doesn't have kind of room for that, because they kick you out once your ego starts to grow with your age. So I think that is a good thing. But I think that one of the things that the last couple of years have really shown us with the Fridays for Future campaign, I think that especially also in Europe, I think that youth have been able to not just been given, but they've taken a larger spot, especially in the global north, because at least from my kind of understanding also on the European scale, very often when you had young people involved in environmental issues, they were more seen of kind of as good tokens and bodies at an action or a demonstration, but you didn't necessarily turn to them for the kind of hardcore political analysis or the strategy. They were just bodies on an action, and you needed that. And I think that what the youth have done for the last years now with the Fridays for Future campaign is to show that they are much more than just bodies at a demonstration. They are the ones who are actually able to set the tone completely for how the debate is going, and how the policies should evolve. And are they? I think they are more so, I guess, regenerative than the older parts of the environmental movement, because they are young. They always you always have new young people get involved. And I think that one of the, I mean, I wouldn't say that Friends of the Earth Norway is really good at regenerative activism. Young Friends of the Earth in Norway, that's another ball game. But I think for us, it's more that we don't necessarily use that time also to gain new people, new activists, and to bring more people aboard, because we're so, I mean, caught up in the struggle and all the work that needs to be done. But so we think that we have to do it all. But with the youth, they manage to get more people involved so that they can share the burden. And I think that is kind of what the rest of us aren't that good at.
Thanks, Silje. Kumi looks like he wants to come in on this. So yeah, please do.
I know, Silje just brought back a memory from my youth, and it's exactly the same example. And, you know, we used to do a lot of what was called pamphlets, you know, leaflets, but we used to call them pamphlets, you know, handing out of pamphlets. And I remember at one meeting, a group of young people stood up and said to the older leaders, "We are sick and tired of being pamphlet fodder. You know, you simply give us the pamphlets and we have to go distribute it. We never ask what should go in the pamphlet. Don't you think we have ideas about what should go to the pamphlets and so on?" The only problem was we were a bit successful in this one context I'm thinking, and we went from one extreme to the other, where to produce one single one-page pamphlet, which before used to take us one day, then started taking us about a week to produce. So sometimes you have to balance efficiency with inclusion. But I think young people today, like older people have a thing of saying, you know, young people are the leaders of tomorrow and so on. I mean, today, young people have to realize that if they wait for tomorrow, there won't be a tomorrow to provide leadership. And if I can just share with you one of the influence in my life that helps me somehow with resilience is my daughter, and at one stage she told me some years ago that people of my generation have failed. You know, we've not delivered. We've been around for so long, and you know, when we say from our experience, you're saying you're contaminated by bad experience, so keep your experience to yourself. So I'm very humble in this conversation, I must tell you, because I would just like to conclude this indisciplined intervention by myself here by saying that I do think we need to listen to what Albert Einstein once said when he said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results. You know, and I'm very influenced by West African anti-colonial leader Amilcar Cabral, who once said, "Tell no lies and claim no easy victories." And in a context now where we are living in probably the most consequential decade in humanity's history, right? What happens in the next 10 years will determine what kind of future we have, indeed, whether we have a future at all. And in that context, I think those of us who consider ourselves justice seekers, truth seekers, and so on, have to be brutally honest with our own shortcomings, not simply for the sake of being critical, but for the sake of us building something more beautiful, more better, more impactful, more unifying, and ultimately more inclusive. Because inclusivity, I think, is an undervalued resource for success in all the struggles that we wage. Thank you. I will be very brief in my next question for being abused.
No, not at all. That's what we're here to do. It's a bit hard to have a dialogue in this format, but equally we can have you all guys all here, which is an amazing thing. And thank you. I love tell no lies and claim no easy victories. That's a beautiful motto. Nnimmo, if I can come to you now, it's a question to move now more into the more resilience aspects of what we're talking about and naming some of the challenges from that perspective. And so, as I was saying at the beginning, climate change is really characterized by senses of, there's this sense of urgency, because of course it is deeply urgent and we are facing irreplaceable loss, and there is deep, deep injustice. And that can bring up also alongside it feelings of deep grief. And I was wondering, does that show up in terms of your practice and how people are engaging and responding, or is that something that is kind of an undercurrent, or how do you see that in the spaces and in the movements in which you're working?
Well, I actually see a lot of contradictions going on in the movements, principally because many, of course, movements all come from people, members of movements come from different geographies. And so there's been a rise of nationalism, a rise of my country first, especially with that, so, some countries. And so even activists get restricted into those boxes rather than being more broad-minded and working more in solidarity with the totality and seeing the big picture. We've all seen clearly that the policymakers actually do all they can to ensure that this status quo remains, that activists are patriotic, maybe, and that you work with you flow with what the nationally determined contribution will be, which is one of the most silly things that I've ever heard in multilateral negotiations. Nations determining what they can do and not doing what they ought to do. I see this as one of the big discrepancies that we're having, and clearly showing that the negotiations, going to the negotiations and all the time we respond to the negotiations, it almost feels like a waste of time, because that system is not looking for a solution, but just looking for how to buy time. That's why you hear about things like net zero. What is net zero? Net zero is not zero. It means you do something you expect that somebody else is absorbing, and then putting the load again on the victims or the most vulnerable. And when you read the text of what many professional NGOs and some movements really push, you are seeing so much hidden words and hidden phrases that actually compound the problem. For example, the official document will say, well, you cannot solve the climate problem without technology. What's the meaning of that? You cannot solve it without the market. What does that mean? The market created the problem in the first place. Colonialism, slavery, all those created the problem. Overconsumption and destruction. All these are what created the problem. And you say that will solve the problem also. It just cannot happen because that system would want to perpetuate itself. And, there are so many issues that sometimes they say we make it a fetish of technology. And sometimes we fall into that trap of believing that technology can solve all problems. You can do geoengineering, for example. You can suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. You can put sun shades in the sky to reflect the radiation back into space. You can make trees that are more efficient in terms of absorbing carbon. You can make the ocean take more carbon and all that. And meanwhile, the southeast coast of Africa is having more cyclones than it ever had, and more intense, and people are dying, and the temperatures of the Indian Ocean is getting higher, and the consequences rising higher to higher latitudes in Africa. And so, you know, I like to remember Ambassador Lumumba of Sudan in 2009 in Copenhagen, when he wept at the press conference. And that time negotiations were pressing for 1 degree, not more than 1 degree Celsius temperature increase above pre-industrial levels. And this man said anything beyond that is putting Africa on fire. And now we are happy to say we're below 2 degrees. It just doesn't make sense to me at all. I can't get it, because right now everything is pointing towards 4 degrees, 5 degrees, or even more. We're setting the world on fire. There's where we're going, there's simply no future. But you know, we have to have hope. And this is why regenerative activism is important. And for me, my hope is I build my hope by keeping my eyes open to the crisis, not by denying or not by believing any false solution, not by believing that carbon slavery will solve the problem of global warming. You know, so the issue is complicated, but we have to really name it. We have to recognize carbon slavery. We have to recognize colonial agriculture creating a problem. I hear people saying agriculture is one of the biggest polluters, but what kind of agriculture? We have to say that this industrial agriculture, chemical agriculture, genetically engineered crops. When people talk about climate smart, we need to ask the question, what is really climate smart agriculture? Which crop? Is indigenous crop not smarter than the crop produced from the laboratory? These are some of the questions that we need, you know, as I find that we don't ask enough questions. And this, coming back to where some of us, we spend a lot of time in activism, and we are ancestors, you know, in our context. You can call us the living ancestors. But myself and Kumi maybe a bigger ancestor, older ancestor than Kumi. But, but you know, when you look at the situation where there's a lot of work that we need to do, eliminating coloniality, the mentality that embedded colonialism in the world. And then again, we need to be more conscious of the fact that many of the imaginaries that is driving the future are not different from the one that created the problem. And so we need to tell ourselves stories in a very frank and open way. And we need to find the commonalities in movements and be bold enough to cut off those who are dragging you down the hole. I believe there's a Chinese saying that said, if you want to get out of a hole, you have to stop digging. And so you have people digging deeper and deeper and deeper and dragging you along. You just have to say, no, I'm not coming along. Unfortunately, it creates a lot of divisions, and then those divisions are exploited. But then we have to recognize that sometimes these divides may not be easy to bridge. But if we can bring ourselves to see the disaster as a disaster, to see the crisis as a crisis, perhaps we can cross those barriers and come together. But when we always think that we can solve the problem without changing the mode of production and consumption, then we're just living in self-denial.
Thanks, Nnimmo, for naming the problems, but also acknowledging what you're saying effectively is that it's important to see the problems and face them and recognize their complexity, and that there is actually a strength in that, and that there is a way of drawing resilience from naming what actually is happening, however complex it is, and focusing on what the actual solutions are and not getting bogged down by, you know, distractions or people who are not actually helping. Silje, would be lovely to have your thoughts on this same question of how issues of grief and loss show up in urgency in the movements when as you've experienced it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we see it on a completely different level now, at least in Norway, than what we did 10 or 20 years ago. I mean, now we have young people from like the age of 13, 14, talking about kind of a sorrow and a grief for the nature that they're not going to be able to experience when they get older. We have also people that are in the movement and have been in the movement for years and years and worked with grassroots communities, also having kind of a sorrow and a grief for the nature that they have seen that is lost. So I mean, it is definitely a part of it now, and I would say much stronger than at least what it was when I first joined, which is some years ago now. So I think that we are seeing it more clearly, but we are also seeing, at least in my mind, that a lot more people are speaking up against it now than what was in the past, and also that a lot of more people from different social groups, different ages, different parts of the country are engaging in environmental issues in a way that they haven't before. Because I also think that we need to realize that at least, and I think that this is a problem for in all of the Nordic countries and in Northern Europe, that the environmental movement is middle class, and that and at least in Norway, really white as well. So I mean, and this is a problem, because how do you reach out to new groups, and also in Norway, how do we reach our own indigenous population? How can we make sure that they feel the loss of nature in a completely different way when in Norway they live from herding reindeers or from the local coastal fisheries. So when you have a winter like the winter that we have for the past year, where their reindeers haven't been able to get the food that they usually would have because of climate change, but still they have no voice in the Norwegian debate. And in the debate on how we're gonna explore our oil resources, or what kind of financial system that we're gonna have, our indigenous peoples have no voice in that debate. And if they use their voice, they're seen as kind of, oh, now you come complaining again. Can't you just be up there in the north and don't make any quarrels and make it hard for us? So this is something, at least, that we have seen for the past, I would say, a couple of years, that more and more they have not, or they are speaking up against the injustices that we still have deeply rooted in the Norwegian political system, and also to have kind of and how we can use their knowledge also in combating climate change with real solutions and not falsehoods.
Silje, thanks so much for naming the different ways in which loss is felt, and the cultural aspects of that also, and the connection with land, and the importance of participation, which I've been hearing from all three of you. So now, Kumi, I'd like to direct this conversation more to the issue now of movements and looking at resilience, more specifically. So resilience in movements is so much more, as we were saying earlier, than only well-being. The well-being is super important. It's also about weathering change. It's about retaining skills and capacity and knowledge, and it's about transforming as a result of change in order to come up with more creative solutions. So actually, in the way that Nnimmo was hinting at earlier, coming back stronger and more empowered rather than being beaten down. So how and what way could there be a sort of systemic approach to resilience within movements that starts to foster some of these capacities?
Thank you, Geeta. Let me just say that following those two very brilliant contributions from Nnimmo and Silje, sort of reminds me of a moment as a young activist in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. If you followed like 2 contributions like that, and you started by saying, most of the really good points I wanted to make have been eloquently made by the previous speakers, but however, for emphasis, and then you spoke for about 2 hours. But I promise to be brief, so let me try to be answering it. So firstly, let me just be quite honest and upfront that I am not a role model for personal resilience. Sadly, I hope nobody is inspired by a lot of the sort of approach, which was give as much as you can and don't think about how you regenerate, how do you, be sharp, how do you replenish, and so on. So, when I burnt out while I was at Amnesty, and was diagnosed with severe hypertension and so on, I had a very, very revealing conversation with a doctor from my past who said, you know what, your doctors there in London have told you that you need to slow down and you need to move on, but you have to realize also that not only because of your health, but because it's the right thing to do as an activist, that you actually take care of yourself. And what he said was basically, you being irresponsible, you continue like this, you could be dead in a short space of time, or get seriously sick and not be able to contribute. But if you made the space, paused a bit, got your health back, maybe you can contribute for another 10 or 15 years. And I got to say, when it was put like that, and basically he said, you're being totally irresponsible. And that was like kind of bit of a wake-up call for me. And as I said, when I stepped down as head of Amnesty, I said it was probably the most courageous decision I ever made, because I realized that finally, I listened to people who had been telling me this all the time, for decades. And so part of building, therefore, where I am now, I'm in a process of learning, and I just offer some of my lessons that are being learned to you. So I don't speak as a specialist at all. So part of building a resilient activism right now, I think, is about being brutally honest about both our strengths and limitations, both institutionally, as collectives, and as individuals. It's also about what Nnimmo said, what solutions are we putting forward? If we do not have an honest, rigorous discourse and narrative, that's not going to make us feel resilient. If in fact, all we are doing is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while humanity sinks, it's not going to keep us strong. If we're not going for the core problem of climate destruction, which is, let's name it, a broken economic system, right, that cannot be reformed. And let's be clear, the climate crisis does not exist in isolation of a deeply, deeply broken and unjust global economic order, right, that has to be, fundamentally transformed. If you look at what we saw after the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, those with power responded with system recovery, system protection, system maintenance. What we needed then and what we need now is system innovation, system redesign, and system transformation. And I want to just note the question that Vicky put in the question, Vicky Robin, where she said, Kumi, I heard somebody say in 1989 that we got 1 decade left. And are we completely out of time? And this is a very difficult thing, because what the science is telling us, that we are, the most optimistic way we can present the moment, right, is that the window of opportunity to avert climate catastrophe on a massive basis, it's already happening, right, but on a totally massive global basis, is tiny and fast closing. But one of the things I've been criticized for in the context of resilience is like once I was speaking in the US and just talking about how the forests were collapsing, ocean disaster and so on. And somebody put up their hand and said, Kumi, have you heard of Martin Luther King? And I said, yes, he inspired me and many people in my back home. And they said, do you know what his most famous speech was called? And I said, I have a dream. And the person shouted, yes, it was I have a dream. But when I hear you speak, it sounds like you have a nightmare, right? So how are you going to inspire people when in fact, if you tell people it's completely, so we have to, this is a real leadership challenge. We have to find the right balance between speaking to power, not sanitizing how deep a crisis we're in, but somehow we have to do it in a way that inspires people to act and not actually leads people to thinking it's all over, so just go chill out. So I conclude by saying that part of it is recognizing that what Nnimmo eloquently said, and that is the production and consumption crisis. And in the interest of time, I refer you to an article that I wrote in the Medium entitled, COVID is horrific, but affluenza is the worst disease affecting humanity right now. And if we don't address it, the unequal patterns of consumption and production, we will not be able to avert catastrophic climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Kumi. Thanks for naming that actually, yes, these issues are replicated in a much wider, bigger system, and that then the challenge for NGOs is not only to not replicate it, but not to end up becoming fodder for that system in the way that they are behaving in their own lives and exhausting themselves, and then just becoming another piece of resource that's been consumed and set aside. And I think what you're naming in terms of the deep system change that's needed and the need to engage with that and look at that is really powerful, while balancing the need to remain positive and the delicate dance with also maintaining your own personal sanctity and resource and ability to continue. None of that is easy, but it's very important, as you say, to acknowledge that is the task. Silje, do you have any thoughts on this particular point about systemic resilience in movements?
Yeah, I think that is kind of crucial to have a more systemic approach to it, because it can't just be up to every individual, because then I think we won't make it at all. And I definitely think that it's a big difference, both from maybe organizations to organizations, but at least I remember the first time I heard the word self-care. I think it was at one of the COPs, I don't remember which, maybe the one in Copenhagen or in Durban, and it came from some of the American activists, and I thought, how very American to be talking about self-care and to have to take a time out to focus on itself or to their own energy. And I thought, what is this? We don't do this in Norway. Self-care. What we have an oil industry to shut down. That's what we need to do. So I think that we need a much more systemic approach to it than what it is today. But also then to understand the structures that we are operating within, and as both Kumi and Nnimmo has talked about, to be able also to not be part of the problem that we're trying to solve.
Brilliant, not being part of the problem that we're trying to solve. And moving on to this question of personal practice. So Nnimmo, as we've mentioned, you've been in situations where your life has literally been on the line, and yet you've continued a long and very distinguished career as an environmental activist. So it would be really helpful and enlightening to hear what your personal practices are. What are your resilience practices? What keeps you going when it gets really difficult and tough? And can we bottle it?
That again, my short answer to that was that the planet has survived this long because it has an inbuilt mechanism to survive. And the planet will survive all of us, will survive humanity. And the planet will thrive without humans, actually. Forget about the story about things reviving because of the pandemic, just for a few moments. Yeah, I think just like Kumi said, and Silje also echoed, I have done very poorly when it comes to staying resilient in terms of consciously engaging in self-care. I've been very poor at that, but there are some things that really keep me going, and it's not very nice. I don't know what I should tell you. It's not a very pretty or beautiful thing. There's one particular place in Ogoniland in the Niger Delta that I visit almost every 2 months, if not every month. And there's a particular tree stump that I go to sit on, to just look at the polluted environment and to remind myself that there's still a lot to be done. And recently, last week, I went there and I found that the stump had been burnt. This stump is more or less gone. I felt like a part of me had been taken away. I couldn't sit anywhere. I could only stand and point at where the stump was. But I think this is, to me, it's a very painful way to build resilience by reminding yourself that there's still so much criminality going on around us. And then one other thing that happened to me, who made it? And I took him to the kids swimming in the polluted river. And both of us spent time talking the kids out of staying in the river, and they came out with oil shining on their bodies. And then we spoke with them about what they would like to, small talk you normally do with kids. What do you want to be in future? What kind of hope do you have? And they all, two of them, one said he would like to be a teacher. One lady said one girl said she would like to be an health care provider. All the other guys, young boys, said they want to be politicians. They want to, because they thought that politicians were those who could do anything and get away with it, and they just keep on. That was really horrible for me to see with those young people. And then when I went back this last week, another bunch of kids jumped into that same water, still covered with crude oil from oil spill, and I did all I could to talk them out, and they wouldn't budge. They didn't come out. They stayed in the water. When you see a thing like that, explaining about the health impact, about the challenges, what's going to happen to them, the skin disease, the cancers and everything, and the children say, well, we have no option. I just tell myself that we have to be sure we provide an option for these children. They have to see clean environment, at least for once. And you just think about who is creating this problem. Transnational oil corporations shipping oil to Europe, to North America, to Asia, to around the world, making their shareholders happy. And yet you find this situation happening in the oil fields. It's really very painful. And but at the same time, it just tells you that, look, you cannot give up now. You cannot give up now. And we just have to push for as long as we can push. But again, I try to spend some time in meditation. Actually, I do a lot of meditation. I engage in a lot of spiritual exercises. And apart from that, I spend a lot of time looking at trees. When I see trees, I feel really happy. Trees, especially when there's a breeze, and you find the trees waving. It's like you have a conversation with the leaves, with the branches, and to me, that is very refreshing. So it's not really none of the things that were like acquisition of things or items that you buy in the shop. No, it's none of those things at all. It's just spending if you can find a quiet time, quiet moment, and then again, investing a lot of energy, sharing stories with younger people, because sooner or later, even not sooner or later, right now, they just have to lead and we should be following them. And so, but the one great problem for me in Nigeria, I would say in West Africa, maybe across the continent, is tackling coloniality. And so we started what we call conversations. The first conversation we had was with Ken, who was executed in 1995. Then we had conversation with Amilcar Cabral of Guinea-Bissau that Kumi referred to, who was an agronomist who turned to become a liberator. And just 2 weeks ago, we had a conversation with Thomas Sankara, the president of Burkina Faso, who was assassinated in 1987. So when you pick up these guys who threw in everything to emancipate their countries, their people, who were truly anti-colonial, who wouldn't accept colonial environmentalism or colonial climate action, but really looked at what could be done, what were the indigenous impulses, what was the wisdom that can resolve the problem, what is the local technology available that people have used over the centuries to make things happen. We had leaders in that mode, and we want the young ones to get to know them. Many young people were born just a few years ago. They were not born before Thomas Sankara was executed in 1987, and these heroes and these guys are not being taught about in school, so we have to find informal ways of sharing this kind of story so that they can really see that it has been done, it can be done. It could be dangerous to do it, like it was dangerous for those guys. Cabral was assassinated, was shot by his friends, his comrades, where the last thing he said to them was, comrades, this is no way to resolve a conflict or an argument, but they are shot man, he died. And so to me, this is one way. We have to, whatever is left of our life has to be poured out into other people. We have to share and also draw energy for the young people, because when you see young people marching, you really feel, wow, there's something worth going, and you try and see how far you can go with them and let them go all the way.
Thanks, Nnimmo. I also wanted to ask about you're a poet and you write too. Does that play a role in your ability to process some of the really harsh and difficult experiences? And it was a heartbreaking story about the children and the tree trunks. I really feel how that must, to endure that kind of thing, must really be.
Yeah. Poetry. One thing about my work, that's what I do in my spare time, poetry. And I find that poetry is very powerful for campaigns and for mobilizations, because people will remember a poem far easier than remembering a long speech. And one of the poems I've done that really resonates is one that has the refrain, we thought it was oil, but it was blood. And people don't easily forget that, because they will say, well, it's true. It's not oil, this is blood. Just like the Uwas of Colombia said, the crude oil is the blood of Mother Earth. Don't drain it, don't spill it. My poetry has been rather reactive. My first collection of poetry was reacting to sit-tight governments in Africa, despots across the continent at one point in time. And then the next volume was Poems on the Run, because I was declared wanted by the Nigerian state and I had to go underground for some months. And so while I'd be underground, I wrote Poems on the Run, which...
Nnimmo, we're losing your sound. Nnimmo, I think maybe you need to go off camera again, unfortunately, because we can't hear you. Okay, hopefully we'll get Nnimmo back. But in the meantime, Kumi, I wanted to ask you the same question, because likewise, you've been an anti-apartheid activist, you've been exiled from your country, and been through so many different activist contexts. So what are your personal resilience practices?
As I said, I'm in a learning mode. So for me, one of the most important things right now is, and has been for about the last 10 years, is planting vegetables. And so for me, the most enjoyable thing is planting something from seed, like even if it's just a tomato or chili, which I use a lot of. And using it in something that and I love cooking, so those are the two things that, but I have started meditating, doing breathing exercises for the first time, trying to do yoga regularly, and I've finally started again being able to run 5 kilometers after like decades. So I've really been investing in just trying to get a little more time to be thinking about what I eat. I used to live in the Netherlands, and they had a very nice slogan in the anti-GMO movement, which was "Weet wat je eet," "Weet wat je eat," which is know what you eat. But I've been doing all of that. But you know, if you would just permit me a liberty to just say that personal resilience and organizational resilience are fundamentally connected in my mind, right? In the sense that if our lives, you know, the feminist movement taught us the personal is the political, right? Which sort of said, you know, no point you having X, Y, and Z values and so on, but you know, not really translating. And if you take the term self-care, Silje, I'm embarrassed to tell you that I just literally learned it. I didn't hear it at the Copenhagen COP or the Durban COP. I was not in those sessions. Clearly, I was not in those sessions. But so much later, and my reaction was a little bit like yours, right? But I saw it more in terms of class rather than in terms of, you know, a particular place. And quite frankly, I just want to say that's bullshit, right? It's taken me decades to come to a realization that it is a political responsibility for us to be taking care of ourselves so that we are as healthy as can be, so that we are here for the struggle, which is a marathon and not a sprint. So we need to be here for a long time and so on. But in terms of being able to do all that, if you don't mind, I just want to take one step back to your earlier question and just make this point that, you know, for us to be able to be resilient, we have to have a plan, right? We have to have a plan that sounds like it can work. And right now, I would say that we need to be able, firstly, to be resilient as individuals. We have to be resilient as civil society, right? And right now, I would say a key imperative is for us to recognize that the current social contract between the state and the citizen, or about government and the people, is completely broken. And one of the manifestations of that is that civic space and democratic space more generally has been shrinking drastically over the last decade, right? And that has huge impacts for organizational resilience as well as for personal resilience, because the impact on activists who are dying in, so Global Witness figure, that statistic that was given, let me just put it in more graphic terms. A couple of years ago, the average was that every week 2 environmental activists got killed somewhere. In 2020, it's 4 environmental activists getting killed every single week somewhere in the world, right? So open societies are closing down. So the best chance at building resilient movements that can deliver the long-term systemic change that is needed is to fight for and create a new social contract that protects our rights to protest, our rights to clean air, our right to water, and our right to a future, right? So more specifically, we need to be creating leaderful movements, right? Leaderful movements, because part of the problem, okay, at the risk of maybe saying something wrong here, Silje, Nnimmo, and myself, you brought us here because you see us as leaders, right? And part of the problem is when we are seen as leaders, and we ourselves have perpetuated it, right? Perhaps, or I have perpetuated it, is that we start behaving in ways of, oh, we must be busy, we must be, you know, taking on so many responsibilities and so on. I know I'm caricaturing it. I never did any of these things consciously. It just felt the urgency. And so I do think that being really committed by generating movements that create an enabling environment for multiple layers of different types of leaders to emerge is a critical success factor of moving forward. The second thing is I draw your attention to a book that was published in the early 1990s called Spider and the Starfish, the Unstoppable Power of Leaderless Organizations. Spiders are hierarchically structured. If you chop their head, they die. Starfish, you chop off one of those thingamajigs, which are actually called arms, they grow into another starfish. So it's spider being centralized, starfish being decentralized. So we need to be building starfish type movements that are as decentralized as possible, especially in a context where we can be guaranteed that as the fossil fuel industry moves closer and closer to its death and other associated industries move closer and closer to decline, you can be guaranteed that they're gonna fight exceptionally hard. And if you think repression is bad now, I'm sorry to say, there is a good chance that repression is gonna get much, much, worse. So all of these things for us to succeed also requires us to embrace intersectionality, right? And this has come out, I think, quite a few times. I won't say more on it. And I just would conclude with these words that I wrote, which said a movement's resilience cannot be an afterthought. It must be built into how we organize, how we operate, and how we function. From the ground up, we must think of how we are embracing modes and methods of action and engagement that are fueling both our cause as well as our mind, body, and spirit. And our resilience lies in the diversity of actors and actions that we can bring into the movement. So we need diverse actors who bring new perspectives into the narrative to keep our movements fresh and contextual. And this provides multiple avenues for engagement to keep energy flowing and progressing. So let me just conclude by saying this also includes us by being less arrogant about what we have thought about as activism. Right, Nnimmo, I don't know whether you've had thoughts about this, because just the fact that you write poetry, you are ahead of the curve in understanding the power of arts and culture for activism. But I think we have not given enough space for activists and creatives in our movements. If anything, we use them very inorganically, come and perform a dance to open a conference or whatever. We need to ensure that arts and culture is intrinsically enshrined in our movements. We need to be open to spiritual leadership. We need to be open to indigenous leaders, practices. And lastly, I would say, we also have to be open to ancient wisdoms, right? Because colonialism wiped out all sorts of resilient activities that were intrinsic to communities around the world. Whether it is, the ayahuasca tradition in the Brazilian Amazon, or whether it is equivalent experiences in West Africa, practices in West Africa, there are ways of healing and resilience that were destroyed by colonialism. And I think part of it is even people like me who might have got a degree from a Western university must stand up now and say, part of the problem is we let wisdoms that were vital for humanity's future get wiped out by colonialism, and we have to fight to bring it back.
Thanks, Kumi. That rousing drawing together of so many of the themes that we're talking about. So I think we've had a really broad-ranging discussion. There have been quite a lot of themes that have come up. There have been a number that have surfaced again, and there have been some questions from the audience while we've been discussing. So I think in the the remaining time that we have left, we have 10-15 minutes or so. So it would be really useful to perhaps explore some of these themes if there are things that you wanted to say or respond to from each other that perhaps you hadn't had a chance to do. And I can also get the ball rolling by sharing a couple of questions that have come from the audience. The first one is around the role of human-centric and eco-centric perspectives. And I noticed when in the discussions that we were having, like you could say in broad terms, there were 3 different ways we were looking at resilience and connection, and they were with ourselves, and they were with people, and they were also with nature, and that was a way of the human nature connection. So it would be interesting to hear thoughts on, it's not, in some ways you could say it's about resilience, but it's perhaps about how human resilience and broader resilience are connected, and what about the resilience in the sense of the non-human world. So maybe let's have some thoughts on that. I think we've lost Nnimmo again, and I hope oh, Nnimmo, are you? Yes, it looks like you're with us, but you're muted. So perhaps if anyone had thoughts on that, do fire away. Wrong kind of analogy for the environmentalists. No firing, please. Do put that seed in the soil.
Yeah, no, but I think that definitely it's also the connection to nature is really important. At least that is something that we see in our organization. I mean, one of the things in Friends of the Earth Norway, I mean, grassroots-based organization with 100 local groups across the country in Norway. And we have many activists who've been activists for many years, engaged with Friends of the Earth Norway. So they joined back in the 70s when they were fighting some of the big mega dams that were planned in Norway. And one of the them is a man called Per, was one of my biggest inspirations. I mean, he was arrested several times, convicted of inciting the people of Norway to protest, and then 30 years later, he got the honor medal from the king for the same incitement of the people. So I mean, it also shows how things change. But I mean, the connection to nature is something that at least Per is talking really vibrant about, and kind of the eco philosophy of everything, and really to be able also to build that stronger resilience also by taking in and having that bond with nature as well. But I would just also say, and it's a comment to some of the things that's been said before, I mean, resilience it's more than just like the personal self-care. It is much more than that, and it's also more than kind of, I think it's both on how to maintain and building a movement where people, it's okay not to work at a maximum of 100%, 120%, 200% every day, that it's allowed to take a step back and have a kind of take a breath. But it's also a movement where the focus also on getting more people and new people engaged is equally important, because if we don't have more people coming in, then kind of everything is on our shoulders. And at least that is, I'm stepping down as chair of Friends of the Earth later now in April. And I mean, I've been a part of the Friends of the Earth family in Norway for the past 20 years or so, and I mean, it's always been a, well, if I'm not going to do it, I have to do this and I have to do that, and one of the problems, I would say, when we have organizations that are so also based on some people, is that they are really vulnerable for change and for people having burnouts and the need to take a step back. But if we, and I think that this is also where kind of the spider and the starfish and that it comes in as well, you know, because you have to build a movement that consists of so many people that it can't be stopped by just taking out one or two or three. So I think that is also, and I at least know that for our part in Norway, that is definitely one of our biggest challenges, is to have more people involved and to have new groups involved, and not just those wonderful people that kind of got active and became activists in the 70s, but also to have people that can come in that are younger as well, and that kind of can continue the fight.
Thanks, Silje. Kumi, I think, Nnimmo, we haven't got back yet. So Nnimmo, I'd like to ask you another question that's come through from our panel, and that's about decolonizing philanthropy and looking at that as a way of building resilience. So if we have a philanthropy which in many respects is based on funding coming from fossil fuels or the extractive sector in some way that's began that journey, what kind of impacts does that have on, funding have on resilience for the environmental movement?
Yeah, I believe it has a very serious impact because truly conscious activists and leaders and groups are careful about where they receive support from. And right now, some of the worst financiers are philanthro-capitalists who are using the cover of philanthropy to push very dangerous notions in the world today. And because they have such powerful, such high, powerful financial leverage, they can almost force people to be silent, to silence people from complaining about the kind of activities they're carrying out, because it becomes politically incorrect to speak against entities who are donating resources for the common good in quotes. And so this is one of the things that closes men's campaign against climate global warming wouldn't, many movements would not, or groups would not take funds from foundations connected to fossil fuel industry or corporations developing toxic chemicals and all such, or who are using slave labor for production. So we find that this has very direct impact. But the good thing, as I said earlier, if I was heard, despite the interruptions by technology, I believe that there are a lot of groups who have erected, who have these barriers of accessing funds because the funds are all tainted with blood, and because the funds are from groups who are actually fighting against exactly what we are campaigning against. But then,
Nnimmo, can you hear us? I think your internet has gone again.
The real movements don't depend. Movements don't necessarily depend so much. Movement is about people. It's about ideas. It's not about
Nnimmo, we're having difficulty hearing you.
Put on the table.
Nnimmo, if you took your camera off, it might be a bit easier.
For certain aspects of okay, I think it's more to sabotage, I think.
So I think you were saying the real currency of movements is in ideas and people.
If you're hearing
and
me, my conclusion was that, okay.
Yeah, please carry on. Yeah. Nnimmo? Oh, it's a shame. I hope we'll get him back. But my understanding of what Nnimmo was saying is that the real currency of movements is in energy and people, and that there's not necessarily a need to be beholden to particular financial sources in the way that perhaps we think we do need to be. So we're coming close to the time to conclude this evening, and I just wanted to give each of our panelists an opportunity to express perhaps what their standout takeaways or thoughts, or the things that, if there were one or two things they'd really want to leave our audience with, or in terms of their own reflections. It would be really wonderful to hear them. So if I can start with you, Silje.
Yeah, I think that it is that we as a movement, I don't think we'll ever be kind of done learning how to be better, and that is something that we still need to do for years and years to come. And I think that as kind of the gravity of the environmental issues and the climate crisis, the nature crisis have grown, and also the movement's grown, I don't think we have managed to at the same time also understand how we can really have a resilient movement that can kind of have the energy to stick around for the long haul, because I don't remember, it was Kumi or Nnimmo said that this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. So we need to have a movement that is built for the long haul, and I think that is both a personal responsibility, but also for all the different organizations and movements that we are working within, to make sure that we try to do this in a much more systematic way, so that we can actually build a movement with more people, with a broader kind of sense of who is engaged within, and also to make sure that nothing is dependent on solely on one. Be more like the starfish and less like the spider.
Thanks, Silje. I love that idea of growth, and of course growth is a very ecological metaphor as well, and that idea that we're all interconnected and that growth can be organic and with each other, and it's not all on our own shoulders. And growth, of course, is part of what we would all be doing anyway, and so it's lovely to see that in that context. So thank you, Silje. Kumi, I'll go to you next, and then I hope we can go to Nnimmo. It looks like we have him back online.
Oh, great. I would endorse all that Silje has just said. It resonates with me. I would say there was one person who asked a really important question that we didn't answer, which I just want to pick up to Tanisha. She said, do women have a role to play in the power transition? The short answer is yes, absolutely yes, absolutely yes. And let's just say, sadly, our movements also have a long way to go to ensure that we fully embrace gender equity, not simply in terms of numbers, but also in terms of culture and enabling environments, for women and men to both succeed. But I'm so hoping that Nnimmo is there, because I wanted to conclude rather than give more words. I thought I would take the inspiration from him, because he's slightly my elder, and it's inspired me in many ways. Even when I didn't know him for like 15 years, I knew his name, but I had not met. He was inspiring me. But one of the things that he and others have inspired me to do is to try to write poetry, and I wrote my first poem during lockdown. So I'm going to end with that, if that's okay.
Love to hear it. Thanks.
And it's called "We're All Desperate to Get Back to Normal, but Should We?" Normal, what an average word. So uninspired, it's actually absurd. In a time when we have been forced to change our ways, to pause and isolate and dream of better days, that we'd ever yearn for the world of yesteryear, a world so divided, so fragmented by fear. It's mind-boggling at best that we might just blow Mother Nature's tests, longing for the same madness that put us in this global sadness. Of me first and screw you, and buy 4 for the price of 2. Surely getting back to normal can't be our aim, after all the sacrifices, death and pain. Yes, this pandemic has brought us to our knees, cutting jobs and highlighting inequality. Our leaders are exposed, and the broken systems they have imposed are now obviously not making any sense. So why do we obsess and resist what needs to be? The end to these failed economic schemes and political machines that weaken and divide, leaving only the elite satisfied. No, we have to be better than this. And if not for ourselves, we must for our kin, our children and their children and the ones after them. Thankfully, our youth has far more motivation to take action and end the years of frustration by breaking down the walls we've created and the inequality that is so outdated. So now, what are you going to do let's hope it is something substantially new to keep building post-corona a human existence that is far from over, learning from our lessons, respecting all persons, especially our healthcare and essential workers, were invisible to many of us before the pandemic, and never again, lest we forget who and what really matters, even when all hope scatters, because this tragedy surely must be our big opportunity to look beyond what has always been and build a world that we can all thrive in. Thank you. Inspired by Nnimmo.
Oh, that's wonderful, Kumi. Thank you so much. If you'd be willing, we'd be lovely to be able to share that with the wider audience via email. So that would be wonderful to have. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Nnimmo,
I was going to request.
sorry, Nnimmo?
Yeah, I was going to ask Kumi to send me a copy of that poem.
Oh.
So
Time, Nnimmo. We're asking for, I was just asking for some closing reflections. If there was one key reflection you had that you would like our audience to perhaps take away with them this evening, as we close for the evening, it would be really wonderful to hear your thoughts on that. And you mentioned that you're an ancestor. You're certainly not an ancestor, but you are an elder who we all respect. So it would make perfect sense to be ending with you.
Thank you so much, Gita. I've really had a struggle tonight with so many internet service providers. Connecting this one gets off. I've tried all of them tonight, and this has been a big struggle. But again, it showed that no matter what, we have to push on. This is what this struggle is all about. We should never allow circumstances around us to determine what we're going to act on. We have to, what should push us is what we believe in, not what is going on around us. And because what goes on around us may be the very thing that needs to be overturned. And as I was I tried to write in a note that the greatest assets that movements have are peoples and ideas. Philanthropy cannot touch that. People with nothing at all in terms of what philanthropy will give can change this world. And so we just need to bring our stories together and bring our ideas together, link our hands together and push on for what is true. This is how young people have changed the imagination of the world just before coronavirus, with millions of people on the streets. And they just needed to just take it a notch higher. We would have seen dramatic changes in the world. But fortunately for those who want the system to remain, coronavirus emerged, either from the laboratory or from the forest or from somewhere. And here we are locked down, and we have to force ourselves to have distance. Can I just read a poem to end this before my internet goes off?
Yes, we'd love to hear a Nnimmo poem too.
Thank you very much. There's this poem I wrote last year. It was about when George Floyd was murdered on the streets of the United States. And I titled it, "We Must Breathe Again." Social distances widen as physical distances shrink. As the knees of the killer cops dug into the neck and body of George Floyd, and law-destroying accomplices held him down with their eyes, ears blocked against our pleas. I can't breathe. As the fire, as the bullets fly, as murderous dogs and never heard of weapons of destruction are unleashed from whitewashed house of weapons of hate, they must hear her shouts. I can't breathe. Flights of fancy, flags of disgust blocks the orbits above our heads. As citizens, black and white, yellow and red, with others far and near, kneel in solidarity against racism, against slavery, against colonialism, against imperialism, declaring, I can't breathe. Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently the air, we kneel in solidarity, a collective push for international solidarity, and declare, never again will the virus of hate and racism take away the breath of our people. We must breathe again.
Oh, thank you, Nnimmo. That was wonderful. Please do share that also so that we can share that with our audience, and that beautiful analogy with that heartbreak and that I can't breathe. And the earth as well. So thank you so much. It's a beautiful, rousing set of thoughts from Silje, Kumi and Nnimmo to end the evening on. All that it leaves me to do is to thank you so much for your time and your thoughtfulness and your contributions and persevering with all the difficulties of internet. In your case, Nnimmo, I'm so glad you stuck with us. And thank you so much, and thank you to our audience. I'm going to now just pause hand over to Lindsay for a few closing words. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who's been part of the series so far. Thank you to all the panelists tonight and to Geeta. I've got so much to learn. I'm really going to look forward to listening to the recording of this, which will be sent out tomorrow, which will be emailed out to everybody. And next week's session is session 4, where we'll be focusing on psychosocial practices for sustaining our movements, and that will be with Stefania Grasso, Dero Tucano and Peter Stutner. So that's next Wednesday. And then the following and final session will be on Sunday the 21st, and that's a participatory workshop on regenerative activism, which will be drawing the themes of the last 4 weeks together, and that will be facilitated by the ULIX team. And just a reminder, if you have already signed up for that workshop, there will be an email sent to you with a survey link. Please complete it so that we can design the workshop around your particular hopes and needs for that session. I think the deadline for that is Monday at noon. So once again, just to say thank you to everybody for tuning in. Thanks for all the questions that have been shared in the chat. And have a really great week, and we look forward to seeing, to learning with you next week. Take care.